Hello, chess friends. This is International Master Valeri Lilov, and welcome to today's lecture on YouTube. Today, we're going to be talking about something very interesting, and I will talk to you about endgames. Most importantly, I'd like to talk to you about pawn endgames. How do pawn endgames work, and what are the key ideas that associate with us being better than the opponent in those type of endgames? So let's begin first by talking about you know a few great examples that were very recently shown by International Master Brian Smith in his method course, in his wonderful method course, I have to say. It's thinking about pawn end games in a slightly different way as opposed to what a lot of people think of them, which is okay, that's all about calculating squares and then figuring out whose king is going to be faster and better than the opponent's. Well, it is not. So we're going to take a look at a few really interesting grandmaster examples. Okay, just a second. I'd like to show you in terms of how do we think about pawn end games. Just a second. I think I've copied the wrong database. No, it's not this one. Just let's see. Pawn end games. I'm sorry. Second. Yeah, I think it's the wrong file database that I'm having. Okay, so there we go. Finally found it. Excuse me for this. So we're going to discuss the key rules of pawn end games first to begin with. So let's discuss what makes a pawn end game successful. For example, we'll start with a very elementary example. Now, probably most of you already know this, but let's discuss. This is a position in which basically white has to figure out where to go. Now, actually, it's interesting because the one who is, the player who's starting ultimately is going to win. Not literally win, but essentially he could find a way to take an advantage. So what is this about? You know, white's to move, and he wins by making an opposition. An opposition is when there are two kings put on the same line with a one square in between them. Now, what's so important about this is that when you see a position like this, the first thing that should come to your mind is that, okay, the player who's got the opposition has an advantage. And it is 100% true. The player who's got the opposition usually has a very solid advantage on his own. So, what you have to keep in mind is why. Oftentimes, the reason why is because an opposition forces the opponent to retreat or move away on a much more of a backward place. So for example, in this case, in this specific situation, black will likely need to play a move like king d6. And then by pushing the opponent's king away so that he cannot stop ours, our king moves forward, invading his position by going up to f5. And then actually after king e7, we just continue pushing him away and continue moving forward. The further the king of ours goes to, the more difficult it will be for the opponent to really move anywhere away. The more he keeps moving away, the easier it will be for us to come through and attack him quite actively. It is a wonderful thing. And you could just see the reason why that's actually happening, because I mean there's just so much. There's so much that he's got to be worried about. Let's see. For instance, now after king e8, we play king e6. Only by pushing black down and controlling the opposition, we keep moving forward and moving forward and moving forward until that point where basically he cannot do anything. This is really where it gets beautiful. Very strong, very important. A lot of times, people neglect the concept of opposition. And yet it is probably the most important concept in chess. Now, if we imagine most important concept in endgames, I mean, if we imagine this type of position being from, black side, as a matter of fact, this is very interesting. Then what you could realize in this situation is that now white could do the move of king e4 very strongly, pushing the black king out of the way, and then we could continue with the move king f5. It's a wonderful thing to do. Black could do king e7, and now after that type of move, of course, then we could realize that there is going to be king e5 coming up. Beautiful. Now black's got to get that king out there on the f7, and this is the time where we play king to the d6. Just wonderful. It's kind of exciting really to understand how that works, but it really works out brilliant. And next move, anywhere he comes down to, we could just play with king e6. Then, on the other hand, if it was his move, king d6, and we can never pass. That is the problem. We could never pass through. This is a really an important thing to keep in mind, but we could not do this. And let's see what we could try to do. Maybe an idea of e4, but the rule is that if we do it like that, then in black plays king e6, there's no chance for us to go any further. So for instance, if you play with e5, then you play king e7. So it's not even a possibility, as a matter of fact, in this kind of position. Perhaps we could go from play king to the d5, but then you do king to the d7, and it's kind of incredibly bad. So what we do in this case is that, for instance, if we have the move of like e6, and then he could just continue with the move of king e7 here, king e8 there, king d8, and again we get to realize the power of this. All what he needs to do is just to constantly keep blocking us. He keeps blocking us, and we can't progress. There's no way on how we could just do anything here. No more of a chance to advance, target, do whatever. So opposition is the key rule in endgames. Whoever has the opposition, that means whoever can push the opponent to move away, controls the opposition, and can do incredible things to take advantage. That's a great way to go for. So I like that, and this is amazing actually as a nice sequence. So we can remember this. Okay, let's take a look. I'm gonna open up now. What I like to do very much is I would actually wish to set up a couple other more complex examples. So bear with me for a second. Oh, by the way, for those of you who are most interested in learning pawn endgames as well as any key endgames, I do recommend Grandmaster Costa Müller's book on endgames. I think this is a great book on endgames, so you could take a look at that. If you're more into video, which is my thing personally, I do recommend you to take a look at Grandmaster Brian Smith's course on endgames. It's a fantastic course once again, and it's provided with a fantastic discount. Right below this video, 50% off just for the next couple hours. You can check this up on the link below the video or on the chat. So let's go with the end game I want to show you here. King and pawns. All right, so let's go with this. This is a super cool position to talk about, and it's about white trying to win. It looks like he's able to, keep the extra pawn, and the position does seem fairly decent. Good. But being able to win is not a very easy thing in this position because black is trying to protect his pawn and keep everything together. So really the big question I think is what should he do right now? What should white try to do to win? Does any of you have a suggestion? Okay, we can't push the king up very quickly because that means he'll play king e4 and he'll be doing very well. f6, now maybe black will just capture. So I don't think that will be a good idea. King e2 is one of the ideas. But then after we play king e2, black can play king f6. You know, so then we can move the king around back. He'll play king e5. So we need a plan, not just to repeat the moves. Anyone have a plan? What can white do? What can white do here? King d2. Yes. This is called triangulation. The point is to force the opponent to be in the same position, but now it's his turn. So we see that the d4 pawn is being attacked, but it is basically black's turn, actually. So it's just very, very important in this moment. If he plays now king d5, we get to advance the pawn and protect it. And now the truth is he can't cope with protecting the f7 and covering the d4 at the same time. On the other hand, if he plays after this move, king, if he doesn't go like that, he'd have to go give away the d4 pawn, which we can confidently take on, and well, we have an easy position. See, so the triangulation is a really interesting way to maneuver with the king towards a position that is both strong and efficient, and yeah, it does work. It's a great example of how to do it right. It's wonderful. A lot of the times it is actually much easier, much simpler, but you need to think about it that way. So let's see another example of a really smart endgame that you have to keep in mind. Okay. So let's see. This is another type of position that I'd like to talk to you about. Super cool, if you ask me. Again, this white to move. It's got the king and the pawn. And the question is, how should he win? A wonderful example out there. And, so this is really interesting. I have to say that when we were actually looking at the position, it seems like white's got a pretty good control. He's got ways to maybe focus on attacking or threatening. But he still needs to find a very precise way to do it. And it's not easy to see how. So, guys, do you think that okay? Now, one of you asked a very cool question, Valerie. Just a quick question: how do you use your opening? How do your openings connect in Endgame? Usually, they don't. Maybe within some cases, the pawn structure or the piece activity, but that's very vague because usually you don't get into an endgame unless the queens get exchanged, and we don't see that in most endgames unless it's a very specific. So, of course, in this position, the way to win for white is not by playing king c3, which would literally allow black to play a3, and now we cannot win by having the extra a pawn. This is impossible. But what we do, as opposed to that, is we actually choose to go the other way around by playing the move king to the b1. Now with king b1, that's a very different story, because with king to the b1, we could now get the chance to bring our king over to a2 and then a3. So now in this case, the interesting part is that if black attempts to ever move with his pawn up to the a3, we could just go b3. King e5, king a2, king d4, king takes a3. And so we realize that as soon as the king does get to capture, it does get to the pawn of a3, it can go to an h4 towards a4, and this is already something brilliant. We do this, we have a clearly winning position, and I mean that's great. This is how it's supposed to be done. Wow, really, I mean this is amazing. But most importantly, I would want to say this is a great idea. The king and the pawns must work very subtle together. It's not easy just to say, oh, look at that, I can put my king over here. It's not enough to say that. You have to be thinking in perspective. Okay, how do you do that by at the same time keep your opponent a little more behind, a little bit more backward? It's tricky. But as white does it in this position, black obviously has many problems. Maneuvering the king so it can go to a position from where it will always stand ahead of the pawn is one of the key ways on how we win those endgames. And even though some may consider that an elementary concept, think again. This is like the first rule. And a lot of times we just don't follow it. So let me show you another interesting example. So just a second. Okay. Now this endgame is pretty awesome. Let's talk about it. Now, here we go. Now, if you're wondering about this, black's pawn is going here, white's pawn is going here. The question is, how would you assess this position? It's a very interesting position. White's got a good king, black's got an awesome king too. He's intending to advance the pawn and keep going forward. So, are these from Yasser Serouan's Endgame book? Yeah, I mean, these are general examples, actually. So Silman's Complete Endgame course is great, too. I do recommend you to take a look at that. But most importantly, don't forget, Brian Smith has actually collected some of the most excellent endgames, and I really like these, a lot of these, because he's explaining a lot of how to think in those endgames and how to really do that. So anyway, let's talk about this position. What should white do in this moment? Very good question. Hmm. As I get to think about this position, now white obviously has a good king that sets it up. So maybe one resource is that we could play with the move of pawn to the f4, so we could get that pawn up to the f5, and then we could move it forth. I mean, why not? That would seem like a really strong resource, and it looks excellent. But then if we go to play with the move of pawn up to the f4, what could really come out is that black could do the move of b5. And so now the issue is going to be that if we play f4, b5, in case white plays with f5, then he can do b4. f6 could be met by the move of b3. And the idea here is that in this position, if we move f7, b2, that will just equalize. So we have no way to advance and get anything through, especially after the f8, b1, which equalizes the game quickly. So it doesn't work. It will not be a good idea. We can't make it happen, even though it looks like a fine, a fair plan. It just doesn't work. Not in this specific position. Not in that way. So what else can white try? What else can we do in this moment? Anyone? Who's playing white? One black. I have no idea. This is just an instructive example. Now, knight king b6 is possible to block the pawn. Unfortunately, he will go to b3. And after f4, he plays king c4. f5, king d5. He holds the pawn, so he can't do anything. Doesn't work. King d6. It does not stop the pawn, but yes, it looks quite interesting in this type of position. So that is great. So for example, after continuing with this move of knight to, so this is a great way to go for it. So for example, after the move of king d6, get ready, and of course, let's see. After that candidate, of course, then essentially black could play king a3, and we can think about king c5. King a4. Now you might be wondering, why did black play at b5? He could have played it. Would have been the same. f4, b5. f5, b4. Now f6, b3, f7, b2 here. And I suppose that should be winning in this position. Or even better, actually go to c3, c4. We could play c3 here, f6 there, f7, b1 queen, f8 check. And now wherever the black king goes, we just deliver the actual checkmate, which is very easy. So this is very interesting. So if black plays with the move of, just if he goes back out there, then just it's great. So one of the interesting things that you have to keep in mind is, just to remember, and yeah, that's a great way to go. So one of the most important things, one of the most valuable ideas actually, is to remember that when you're calculating, when you're analyzing in a position of that kind, all about that. Not so much, hey, who's going to advance or promote first? Who is going to do this or who's going to do that? Well, most important thing that you would like to keep in mind actually is that first and foremost, you must be considering, and that's a big idea, must be considering the principle that in most times activity of the pieces is what you would like to keep in mind first. That's a great way to go forward. And then after you play with the move of f6, then just f8 here, and queen b8 and everything. So yeah, that's great. King, just I mean, but then okay, now actually it wouldn't have worked out too well because black could do king to the b3. So this is why white plays a little bit better. He moves the king to the c3, going for the position of f6 check, and then we've got the chance to checkmate him right from this point. It's a great way to follow up in this case, and it's awesome. Okay, great. I like that position. It's a really instructive example, and it helps to see how to follow actually. So it's great. Okay. All right. Here we go. Now, I would really like to take a look at another example of an endgame. So you could see that it's a little beyond just activity of the pieces. It's also about smart calculation and how to do that. Okay, this is a big thing. This is an example I want to show you. Another super instructive endgame, at least in my opinion. It's white to move. So what would we like to do in this case? Hmm. Yeah, let's see. And I gotta say that white's got a very nice looking pawn in this position. On the other hand, black is kind of ready to move around. Maybe he could even go for a king to the c3 or a king to b4, which could be a nice thing. So what to do now with white? We'd like to be actually analyzing and thinking here. What's white's best way to go? Let's take a second and think very carefully about this position. I mean, the easiest way to go about this position, of course, is simply to move along with king e6. Everybody, yeah, it's white to move. Then black plays what? He just comes back. King e6, king to the c3, king d6, king d4, king c6, king e5, king b7, king d6. Before we know it, the moment we capture the pawn, then he's going to go play king c7, and that's it. It's just not possible to win. We don't want to go. What we want to go is to go back to the very beginning and think a little more about what approach could actually help white to succeed. And that is wonderful, if you ask me. The approach that white needs to take is not just to play it generally, but actually continue in a perfect way. What I'm talking about, that's a big move, by the way. What I'm really talking about is going along the route with, first of all, playing the move of king to the e6 in this type of position. And then after the move of king to the e6, essentially, if black plays with king to the c3, then we can think about king to the d5. The king is going up, and what's happening in this type of position is that it's not just going up, but it is advancing perfectly. We get that king going forward, and we have the ability to now drive black backward. So, for instance, in this case, should he play with king b4, we can do king to the c6. Here, he does not get in time at the position to make the opposition, and then we have king b8. It's interesting that there's a little detail, just one little detail between the moves of king d5 and king d6. Both moves that you would rather say they're very much the same. I mean, it really looks like it. So what's the difference? Big, big difference. You see, the most important in such a position is just the control. Beautiful sequence that helps black to become super successful in that type of position. It's just that one move, king d5, and that's what wins. Really, this is where it's supposed to win. This is where it's supposed to go. What comes out next in the game? Actually, it's after king d5, king b4, king c6. Apparently, white is beautiful here. He's winning, so don't have anything else to say except this is how it's supposed to go. Very strong, very efficient, very effectively played out. So that's about it. This was great, easy, and quite beautiful overall. Just not too many other things that I could say. Very interestingly. So give me 1 second. I'm gonna save this, and let me show you another super cool example about endgames, pawn endgames in particular. Let's see a little more complicated endgame. Maybe you do know about this, or maybe you don't. Could be that you don't. Truth is, this is the one endgame that my dad used to teach me a lot about, and I couldn't figure it out when I was younger. This is a position in which white has a good pawn on the c, and yet we realize that advancing it really isn't going to matter. Advancing it is only going to help the opponent, as all he needs is to just advance his own pawn and go forward pretty quickly. So it's a bad thing. It's a really, really bad idea. Okay, bad thing. So what do we do now? How to think or play or go about this? Now, essentially, c7, king b7 apparently loses. We can't push in this type of a position, so it's not great. Now, what we could do, of course, is to think about a slightly different idea. So, for instance, we could be considering the plan or the concept to, let's just go back. What other moves do we have available? Is there anything else that we could do? Is there anything different? So I think it's possible that we play a move like, say, maybe King G7, but then he would just keep pushing the pawn out there. So that really wouldn't work all too well. Looks like a problem too. So how to go about this? Hmm. I really like this position, by the way. I want to say that because it's true. I mean, we could play c7 with the pawn, but that's really not going to work all too well because the black is just going to go back and it will stabilize and it will solidify. So we don't want this to be done. What can we do? That's really the big question that we've got to ask ourselves. What is the best idea? What's the best activity? Well, indeed, it is a great question. First, we must come together. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that if you're ever going to do anything in such a position, you must get your pieces, like close together. And how do we do that? King G7, King F6. And in this case, after King F6 is played, when black advances with that pawn right up, we could go for the move of King. Now you may be wondering, what is this? But we could do this type of move, King E7. Now, point being is that as soon as it's done just like that, we've got an excellent opportunity. We've got the chance to advance and put pressure. And then you understand why that is. I mean, like the truth is that as soon as it's done, he's got a problem. Let's imagine that he will actually continue with a move like, say, King B6. But then what we can do is come forward with a move of now King to D7. And then after we continue with the move King to the D7, we could play H3, C, pawn, advance, pushing, going forward. And now after H1, actually King B7, this is how we do it. King supports the pawn. And because of that thing, because of the fact that we're actually supporting the pawn, we have everything under control. It's a great move, very easy, very simple to play, no complications. It's great. Like now, really, truth is, let's we get it going. We have that king go up in the position, and the pawn is promoted. Because once again, everything has to do with past, piece activity. If that is done, if this is the most important thing you do, then it's easy to fix it. So we go that well with c7, king b7, king to the d. We get to have the pawn push to promote out there, which is so effective, so simple, and no complications, of course, at all. Great stuff. Very good. So this is really my thinking, just like how we have to be analyzing and instructively going forward this way. So it was easy. Okay, of course. Now let's talk about another kind of example that you could really keep in mind whenever it comes down to playing these positions. So what example do you want? Am I actually talking about? A couple, really, not very complicated. So let me bring it up. Where do we bring them up? Okay, here we go. Here it is. Now, the next one. The next example, the next endgame, is a typical one. Now, you may know it or you may not know it. In case you do not know it, that's even better. But you might want to know. This is why oftentimes in endgames you would like to be thinking about advanced pawns. Now, don't advance them too fast or too far, because if they're advanced too fast or too far, they could become pretty big weaknesses. But yet, in this position, it is about what white should do. And I have to say, he's got a fairly, good position. He's got some nice pieces and good control and things like that. So it's pretty important. So what is the best way to go about a position of this kind? Very interesting. First of all, when we are basically playing this, okay, let's take a look. The most important thing is to decide, okay, how should white advance? Like, how should we go about this? Great example. First of all, I always recommend that concentrate your attention. Okay, concentrate your attention on breakthrough. The breakthrough is oftentimes, let's call it a nice move that helps you to get again to push away one of the opponent's good pawns and then give yourself a pass pawn. In that case, it's b6. If black takes with this pawn, we play a6 and c6, so he can't stop us. On the other hand, if he actually does go for 8x to the b in this position, then we could do c6 powerfully, and then after c6 to the b, a6 to get that pawn going. Either way, it is pretty awesome. And I'd like to say that in this position, there is very little that you've got to worry about. Very interesting idea. This is how it's done. Oftentimes, that's what advanced pawns can do. They're a great idea, and if you can make them right, if you can push them in the proper way, can be very successful. Takes a movement or two, but yeah, we do it. However, I do want to advise that caution. What kind of caution? The caution is that if you advance them too early or too quickly, you could get yourself in trouble. So be careful. I'm not saying that you should not do that. Just be careful. Because if you do them, as I said, because if you advance them a little bit too quickly or whatever, you can get yourself in a big trouble very easily. So you want to exercise caution. Let's take a look at another game that I would really like to bring up. So let's see. Okay. Next one I want to bring is here. Let's talk about this pawn endgame. Now, this pawn endgame is fairly important. Now, we're starting with the more complex pawn endgames right now. A more complex pawn endgame in which white's got to figure out how to advance and get going, what to do in this position. Very interesting. So I gotta say that this is a nice position. He's got that it's a pretty good looking pawn, good pieces. So what is the best way to play here? What are the right ideas, so to speak? Hmm. It's a pretty interesting thing because I gotta say, if we go for a move like King B5 or whatever, it's really not going to work. I mean, let's face it. I don't mind the move. I think it's likely going to be okay to play it, but the problem is that if we do go with a move like King up there, he will likely play H5, and well, let me put it this way: I don't want you to feel like this is good or bad or anything. Just there's a problem, and the problem is going to be, you know, pass pawn is powerful. So instead of actually playing this type of move, what we're doing is we're creating a passer pawn. The passer pawn being this one. Easy, effective, and really, really powerful. Now, what's going on after a4? Well, If we play the move of pawn to a4, let's imagine he plays a move like pawn to the h here. So what to do next? We do a5. He can play h here. That's fine. Not a problem. It's okay. Because then we could go for, yes, you guessed it right, b6. Two things that matter most in endgames: piece activity and passed pawns. And we're not just talking about pawn endgames. In particular, that's very relevant for any endgames. We got 8x to the b, a6, h3, a7, and we actually suddenly find out that white's even faster, even though he had to move 2 pawns while black had to move only 1. It's a really exciting type of position, but that's what helps him. So remember those couple principles: piece activity and pass pawns will help you a lot. Now, we have to end a little earlier today because I feel a little tired and I've got also something very important to attend to. But I'd like to thank you all for joining me tonight for a great lesson on pawn endgames. Once again, I do recommend you to check Brian Smith's fantastic course on endgames and other strategies for the link below. It's only available for a few hours. So take a look at that. And of course, again, make sure that every time when you play an end game, you guide yourselves by the key principles. Thank you so much, and I'll speak to you next weekend.